Nintendo are known for creating some of the very best-selling video game handheld devices ever made, all the way from the original Game Boy to the 3DS. However, before the Game Boy rose to success, there was another series of handhelds called the Game & Watch, and in order to talk about these devices we need to go all the way back to the very beginning of Nintendo's story. Nintendo is a much older company than most people realise, being founded all the way back in 1889 and initially being a manufacturer of different types of playing cards. Where things started to turn for the company though was in 1965 when they hired a man called Gunpei Yokoi. The company was starting to struggle due to the demand for playing cards dropping due to more variety in other hobbies such as the rise of pachinko machines and better access to other social activities such as bowling. In order to stay ahead of the curve, they went through a huge restructuring, putting more effort into the development of new products, and one of these new development teams was going to be focused on toys. The head of this new unit? None other than Gunpei Yokoi, who happened to have a knack for manufacturing creative products. At first, they were making standard stuff, chess, mahjong, and other classic board games. However, they also started dabbling in electronic toys. This includes the beam gun, which is considered one of the earliest examples of an affordable light gun. Despite featuring similar technology, this wasn't your typical video game light gun though, and instead had you shoot a target on a physical toy, which made it fall over. It wasn't until 1972 that Nintendo used the prior experience with the beam gun to create the shooting gallery for the Magnavox Odyssey, officially marking Nintendo's first foray into video games. Meanwhile, Gunpei Yokoi continued to show his skill at creating hit products, with the Ultra Hand, Ultra Machine, Ultra Scope, and the Love Tester being some of the toys that he's credited with creating. Nintendo continued making both video game related products as well as standard toys, but the major turning point for the company happened in 1980 when the original Game & Watch released.
Game Watch, Game Watch, Game Watch, Game Watch. It's a demo Game Watch, don't demo Game Watch, dale demo Game Watch, Game Watch.
Nintendo had already achieved success with the Color TV game line of home consoles, having sold 3 million units, making them the highest selling first generation consoles. However, these were only available in Japan, so it wasn't until the Game & Watch that Nintendo would become an established name across the globe. And if you want to learn more about how this happened, then check out a book, A Handheld History, which is available to pre-order on Amazon right now. Reportedly, the idea for a portable gaming device came to Gunpei Yokoi as he was on a train and watched as a bored passenger fumbled around with a calculator, typing in random numbers to pass the time. Yokoi knew that there had to be a better way of entertaining yourself on your work commute, and thus the spark of an idea that would literally change the landscape of video games as we knew them was ignited. That might sound like I'm just being dramatic, but literally, the Game & Watch was the very first handheld gaming device ever made. Without this, who knows if portable gaming would even exist? Yokoi apparently took his concept for the Game & Watch to the higher ups at Nintendo and Sharp, who Nintendo were working with at the time to manufacture their hardware, and immediately received the green light to produce several units. Even these executives must have seen the promise in the idea of portable gaming. Because the Game & Watch used the same technology found in an old calculator, having a simple LCD screen and primitive graphics, which instead of having any kind of real fluid animation, simply flicked between different still images to replicate movement, and because it used cheap disposable batteries, the cost of the Game & Watch systems were not only low to manufacture, but also affordable for the customers too, costing 5,800 yen in 1980, which when adjusted for today's inflation is equal to approximately £50 or $63. device. Bear in mind though that not only was there nothing else like this on the market at the time, but it also doubled up as not only a game, but a clock too, hence the name Game & Watch. Now that's good value. Game & Watch systems were different to handheld devices we typically see today due to them not having interchangeable cartridges and each device being specifically made to play a singular game. There was a whopping 59 of these released between the years of 1980 to 1991 and they were a massive success, selling upwards of 43 million units across the world, and they definitely helped to put Nintendo on the map as a serious video game hardware and software manufacturer. In Japan, the release of the Game & Watch was reasonably straightforward. The initial 5 games were known as the silver screen models, and these consisted of Ball, Flagman, Vermin, Fire, and Judge. And while these did get a release in North America in the same year, 4 of them were originally distributed by a company called Mego under the name Time Out instead of Game & Watch.
Jogging gave you fallen arches. Take Time Out. Tennis gave you tennis elbow. Take Time Out, the new electronic sport where size and strength won't help.
The names of these 4 Time Out branded games were also altered, with Ball being Toss Up, Flagman being Flagman, that's with an added space, Vermin being the Exterminator, and Fire being Fireman Fireman. Despite this era of Nintendo being a massively important part of the company's history, these Mego Time Out devices seem to have hardly any information about them online. From what I've gathered, Mego was given the license to produce these devices just before Nintendo of America got properly set up, but then after a short period they were able to manufacture them on their own, which is when the standard Game & Watch branded devices started to get released throughout the States with their original names. This is probably why Judge didn't get a Time Out branded device, with this being the last of the 5 silver screen Game & Watch games. Nintendo must have been in a position to manufacture this one by themselves at that point. After the 1980 run of silver screen devices came the 1981 gold screen series, which features the rarest of all of the Game & Watch games, Headache. If this doesn't sound familiar, it might be because it was only known by this title in the UK. In every single other territory in the world, it was called Helmet, and you can find this version fairly easily. The name change is simply due to the fact that helmet was classed as a derogatory term in the UK, so the name was changed here, and this altered Headache version only sold around 6,000 copies. Also released in 1981 was the widescreen series, and this is where the production of the Game & Watch really kicked up a gear. There were 5 silver screens, 3 gold screens, but a total of 10 widescreens. And it's also in this line where we started to get some licensed games show up, featuring Popeye, Mickey Mouse, and Snoopy. Snoopy Tennis is one of the Game & Watch devices I actually have in my collection, releasing in 1982, making it the oldest game I currently own. We also saw our first re-release with a widescreen version of Fire, which was one of the original silver screen games. In 1982 we also got the debut of the multi-screen variants, and these are probably my favourites. By far the best selling of any Game & Watch device was 1982's Donkey Kong. This was helped by the massive success of the original arcade game, which released a year prior in 1981, and also by this new multi-screen form factor. Donkey Kong actually wasn't the first multi-screen Game & Watch, being slightly pipped to the post by Oil Panic, which released only a few days prior. But Donkey Kong sent this new design into the spotlight. This thing alone sold 8 million units. Donkey Kong is a particularly interesting device as well, because not only was it the first Game & Watch device to feature previously existing Nintendo characters, and not only because it features a clamshell design which quite clearly served as the inspiration for the Nintendo DS, but even more importantly, it was the first time that a D-pad was ever seen, predating the NES, or rather the Famicom as it was known in Japan, by a whole year. So the Game & Watch not only changed the landscape of portable gaming, but with Donkey Kong's D-pad, it even had a massive impact on home console gaming too. I mean, without the D-pad, controllers nowadays would probably look completely different. And it's safe to say that this particular Game & Watch has impacted practically every single video game controller that you've ever used. Gunpei Yokoi really was a legend. He practically created handheld gaming, he designed all of these Game & Watch systems, and now he's even invented the D-pad too. What a guy! 15 multi-screen devices were made, and while most of them used this same DS-style design, there were 3 that used a horizontally opening design instead. One of these is 1983's Mario Bros, which not only opens kinda like a book, but instead of using the D-pad, it uses these interesting buttons that almost feel like light switches. One of the things I love about the Game & Watch series is that all of these devices have their own little quirks and design elements that make each one stand out. It makes them pretty interesting to collect and play, and you can't really replicate that through any kind of emulation. Also, starting in 1982, we had the final standard variant of the Game & Watch with the new widescreen range. These were based on the original run of widescreen devices, but this time featured much more colourful exteriors, with the final one being Mario the Juggler, released in 1991. Before that though, in 1983, we actually had a sort of side series to the main Game & Watch units called the Game & Watch Tabletop. These were a massive departure from the design of the traditional Game & Watches and were much more bulky, requiring much bigger C batteries, and even featuring colour screens too. Despite these things being technically portable though, they weren't exactly pocketable and you couldn't just take them everywhere with you. They ended up selling much more poorly than the standard Game & Watch series and only received a total of 4 games. Then we had the Game & Watch Panorama screen line, which was much more portable than the tabletop series. These also featured colour screens, and the gimmick with these devices is that the game was actually projected down onto a mirror and you played the game looking into this mirror instead of a typical screen. This is because in order to give the game colour, it needed a light source, and backlighting the screen would have made the device way too expensive, so instead they used natural light, which enters the top of the section that you would pull up, shines onto the LCD display, and then that is projected onto the mirror, which allows you to see the gameplay. The tabletop variants also used this exact same mirror trick too, but with the panorama screen, it's far more pocketable in size, and you can much more clearly see what's happening to make the colour screen work. And once again, these things didn't sell as well as the standard Game & Watch systems and were discontinued after only having 6 games. But hey, that's still better than the tabletop series at least. Next up we have 1984's Super Colour variants, of which only 2 were ever made. These much more closely resembled the normal design of the Game & Watch, but were vertically orientated instead of horizontally. The other obvious gimmick is that once again they feature colour, although this is much simpler than the tabletop and panorama screen versions, with these ones just featuring solid blocks of different colours which go up the screen. Normal Game & Watch systems did feature colour in the backgrounds through the use of art that was literally printed onto sheets of clear plastic, making up layers in the display which gave the image depth, but the Super Colour systems had whole blocks of coloured plastic, which made it appear as though the LCD images weren't just black. Whereas with a standard Game & Watch, the moving LCD parts of the screen always had no colour. I'm not exactly sure why, although I do have a few theories that I'll get into later in the video, but these Super Colour Game & Watch variants didn't sell very well and never received a second run. In 1984 we had the Game & Watch Micro Versus system, where the main gimmick was on 2-player functionality. These devices had actual controllers which were hardwired into the main game unit, and this allowed you to play games with another person as you both huddled over the screen together. This is actually a pretty good idea, because I remember playing Mario Bros with another person, with each of you holding one side of the device and each controlling either Mario or Luigi depending on what side you were on. So this Micro Versus system just feels like a natural extension of that. And I bet you can't guess what happened next. Yep, these things didn't sell very well and were discontinued after only 3 games. Who would have seen that one coming? In 1986, we then had the crystal screen variants, and these actually didn't feature a back to the screen, which allowed you to literally see through the LCD layers to whatever was placed behind the console. The idea here is that you could use whatever background you want. You could draw your own picture and hold it against the back of the device, or you could hold it against a magazine or a comic to give it any kind of background you can imagine. Yep, that's right. Only 3 were ever made, and these once again didn't sell very well. You would have thought that Nintendo would have been seeing a pattern emerge in here, wouldn't you? Now, something to note is that despite the tabletop, panorama screen, super color, micro versus system, and crystal screen Game & Watches not selling as well, this probably wasn't entirely Nintendo's fault, because what else happened between the years of 1983 to 1985, which is when most of these different variants came out? The video game crash of 1983. This is a whole other story altogether, and to cover this properly would require its own video, but basically, demand for video game devices were at an all-time low due to market saturation and the low quality of most of the products being produced. And this lack of customer interest probably heavily affected what Nintendo were attempting to do with the Game & Watch series. Had these variant systems released a few years earlier, they could have been a success, but unfortunately, the timing was a bit off. Luckily though, the release of the Famicom in 1983 and the NES in 1985 revitalized the game industry and saw Nintendo reach even greater heights than ever before, becoming a household name and officially entering the cultural zeitgeist. In 1989, the world was introduced to the Game & Watch's successor, a little-known device called the Game Boy, which yet again was designed by Gunpei Yokoi. And rather than requiring a brand new device for every game, the Game Boy instead was a singular console which featured swappable game cartridges, much more similarly to how the NES functioned. It also used the same D-pad design from the Donkey Kong Game & Watch, which at this point was a staple across every Nintendo product, including the NES. With the Game Boy taking the world by storm, the Game & Watch was largely forgotten, overshadowed by the absolutely unheard of sales figures of its successor, but much later it did receive some love in the form of a special edition re-release of the Game & Watch title that started it all, Ball. This was released in 2010 and was offered to Club Nintendo members to celebrate the Game & Watch's 30th anniversary. This re-release is functionally exactly the same as the original release, but featured slightly updated branding and quality of life updates like a mute option, but it still remains very faithful to the original design. Even more recently, there was the 35th anniversary edition Game & Watch versions of Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda, released in 2020 and 2021 respectively. But really, these aren't actual Game & Watch systems, and instead just feature the shell of a Game & Watch, which plays the NES games from these series, and features a few Easter eggs harkening back to the Game & Watch's roots. The display here is a standard LED screen, it features a normal modern rechargeable battery, and elements of its design have been tweaked to be more practical for today's audience. So really, with all of these design updates, I don't think this can be considered an official Game & Watch. It's still very cool to see Nintendo's early legacy respected like this though. A lesser known series of hardware featuring Game & Watch titles is the Nintendo Mini Classics series. These debuted in 1998 and were basically tiny devices which looked similar to the Game Boy but featured LCD screens and had Game & Watch games on them. Interestingly, they also had a clock function which harkens back to the dual functionality of the Game & Watch. Even certain multi-screen games were re-released as a Nintendo Mini Classic, featuring a flip screen to keep the gameplay authentic. Weirdly, despite the Nintendo Mini Classics line pretty much existing as a way of cheaply re-releasing Game & Watch games, there were Nintendo Mini Classics released which featured brand new original games, most of which were based on existing properties or were licensed games. These are basically the closest thing that you're ever gonna get to a new official Game & Watch game. You've got stuff like Spider-Man, Yu-Gi-Oh!, Smurfs, and even Tetris, which was actually rumoured to get an official Game & Watch version at one point, but this unfortunately never happened. On top of these hardware re-releases, Game & Watch games have actually quite frequently been re-released in compilation packs and on digital stores, starting with the Game & Watch Gallery series, which spanned 5 games across the Game Boy line of systems. This is probably one of the more accessible ways to play a lot of these Game & Watch games, and they not only offer the original versions of a selection of titles, but even modernised versions too, which have been updated with new graphics and controls. We then had the Game & Watch Collection series, which weirdly was only available to Club Nintendo members, and this was interesting because these were released on the DS, allowing the multi-screen games to be played in a more authentic manner, utilising the top and bottom screens of the DS in the same way they would have in their original format. With Nintendo starting to properly support online stores with the DSi and 3DS, certain Game & Watch games were available to purchase individually on the eShop too. However, the selection offered was actually quite small, only having 9 titles in total to choose from. Going forward, what I would like to see with the future of the Game & Watch is potentially an officially made, purpose-built device which can accurately emulate every single Game & Watch game ever released. I suppose it would be akin to the NES and SNES Classic editions, only a handheld which was made entirely to play Game & Watch titles. That way you could go back and experience one of Nintendo's earliest ventures into the video game space and see for yourself how revolutionary this would have been at the time without needing to go out and spend thousands on buying 59 individual devices. But with that, we've covered the entire history of the Game & Watch. Who would have thought that there would have been this much to talk about with such primitive devices? Still, the legacy can't be denied. Without these things, not only do I think that Nintendo would be in a very different place right now, but I think the entire landscape of gaming in general would be different too. Home consoles and handheld devices alike owe a lot to these little guys. But with that, I hope you've enjoyed the video, and if you have, definitely give it a like, and comment down below letting me know if you've ever actually played one of these Game & Watch devices before, and what your favourite one is. Also subscribe if you want to see more retro gaming goodness coming soon, and I've been Rob from Retro Dodo, and I'll see you in the next one.